When one considers the diversity of life on our planet, one could ask, where does it come from? Perhaps especially when a great number of living things appear at one time, as in these birds or these flies. Does life arise spontaneously from inanimate matter? Well, today we obviously know that this is not true. The cell theory states that all cells come from pre-existing cells. This would apply to these bacteria. Many organisms can have sex, including protists. In fact, protists were the ones who invented sex, so these paramecia are engaged in sexual reproduction. Flies have sex, frogs have sex, and so therefore the origin of these living things is not in a spontaneous generation from inanimate matter, but rather through sexual reproduction, life coming from non-life. The people in the ancient world did not know this. Some reflected on passages from the Bible where life does arise spontaneously from inanimate matter. This obviously applies to the Genesis creation story, but also in Exodus, where Moses and Aaron, and then also the Egyptian magicians, can cause rods to become snakes, or could cause lice and frogs to arise out of dust or the mud of the Nile. St. Augustine held that life could arise from inanimate matter and used this to explain how the Noachian flood might have been more reasonable. Perhaps Noah did not have to fit all organisms on the ark because so many can arise spontaneously from the mud and dust, etc. So Noah did not need to bring them. And instead of transporting animals from a distant land and then back to the distant land, perhaps these animals could then arise inanimately in that distant land, once again, thus making Noah's job easier, and thus the idea of the Noachian ark more plausible. St. Thomas Aquinas felt that, quote, imperfect animals, unquote, can come to be through spontaneous generation, especially through decomposing matter. Matter either has the power to generate life due to an original power given to the elements or to the influence of the stars. For imperfect animals, the influence of heavenly bodies alone suffices, and it is through this power that angels and demons can influence the production of living things. Luther felt that mice and flies could arise spontaneously, mice from decaying matter. While he wasn't positive about birds, he thought the idea that migrating birds migrate south and then lie dead in the waters until springtime when they come back to life and return was a miraculous proof of the resurrection. Calvin interpreted the Bible to mean that the original divine command that the waters bring forth fishes never stopped being effective, and so that every day fish are generated from water through spontaneous generation. Many other theologians argued that living things arose spontaneously from non-living things, whether this be grasshoppers, mice, frogs, eels, scorpions, bees, etc. Some argued that certain living things, such as an insect which was bothersome, might have arisen through the action of demons or witchcraft. The idea of spontaneous generation persisted for centuries, perhaps influenced by literal interpretations of biblical passages, but it should be noted at the very least, these theologians, the most prominent theologians included, felt that the idea of spontaneous generation did not conflict with their religious beliefs. Interestingly, Cotton Mather chose, instead of taking the literal interpretation of passages as he did elsewhere, chose to use arguments of others and evidence from nature to contradict the idea of spontaneous generation. Some of those who argued for spontaneous generation reconciled this belief with the Genesis account of creation by feeling that the Genesis account referred to a life-giving force in matter. Thus, all life which later arose from matter could be dated back to this life-giving force at creation. Before the life cycle of parasitic worms was understood, it was believed that they generated spontaneously in human intestines. This belief was reconciled with the Genesis account of creation by stating that Adam had not only the seeds of all future humanity in him, but also the seeds of all future intestinal worms. Some creationists say that no, it is the evolutionists who claim spontaneous generation occurs because of the idea that life arose abiotically from the non-living earth. I would just like to argue two counter statements. First, the question of spontaneous generation typically applies to the idea of whether mice, frogs, flies, fish, etc., things we see alive in the modern world, arise spontaneously from inanimate matter. We know that the answer is that they don't. They only arise from their parents of the same species. But in the past, many individuals, including the most prominent theologians, felt that this idea of spontaneous generation was not only harmonious with their religious beliefs, but also inspired by a literal interpretation of certain biblical passages. The question as to whether a non-living planet, given millions of years, can produce a number of chemical reactions to the point that balls of protein, lipid, and nucleic acid cross a threshold to a pre-cell. Now, that question can be argued elsewhere, as I do, but that is a completely different question as to whether life could arise from a non-living planet from the sum of all of its chemical reactions over millions of years, compared to did the bird, fish, frog, and fly that I just saw pop out of the mud. So those are two different questions, only one of which has been addressed here.